and many talk about the significance of the sanctions. We have to take a look at exactly what these sanctions are. We talk about the exports of natural resources being banned, international banking activities being banned, and most importantly, that is the shipping in and out toward the DPRK will be checked by relevant governments. Yep. What would that mean, Mr. Yang?
Well, first of all, it's an effective measure to prevent North Korea from smuggling dual-use goods for their nuclear and missile programs by the inspection for all cargoes, both in and out of the North Korea, and also smuggling to proliferation. So, but the side product is that will make foreign trade in North Korea in a more difficult situation, and increase the risks for North Korean trading partners. So that's a mixed effects made by the
But the most important question is whether the sanction is likely to work. It's going to serve the purpose of prevent DPRK of going further on the so-called nuclear weapon cause it has already sought. Ms. Guasoni, what do you make of the possible effectiveness of this sanction, the new round?
Well, sanctions can never totally prevent a country from pursuing weapons of mass destruction programs. But what they can do is make it more difficult and more costly. And your other guest is absolutely right. You know, North Korea has used shipping to a great degree as a kind of a shell game. A lot of entities, a lot of flag swapping on these ships so that they can hide shipments. And so I think a strengthening of that, and also China's willingness to actually inspect cargo might help. Will it solve the problem? No. Kim Jong-un is absolutely committed to pursuing his nuclear and ballistic missile programs.
Right. And now we're also joined by Ms. Catherine Moon, who is a senior fellow from the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to you as well, Ms. Moon. Of course, your ancestors are originally coming from South Korea, and you are an American citizen. So let me ask you about this. South Korea Foreign Minister talked about today for even further actions against the DPRK. Is this round of sanctions, you think, satisfying to a certain extent? What do you make, from your perspective, about the effectiveness of it, possibly?
Well, I think we have to think about sanctions on various levels. One is, of course, to slow down, if not stop, the nuclear and missile development of the DPRK. But sanctions also serve a diplomatic function. And for South Korea, I think, getting China and the United States to work together to support South Korea's very strong stance against the DPRK is a diplomatic win. So I think from Seoul's perspective, strong sanctions coming out of the UNSC, Security Council, will be seen as a diplomatic win for South Korea vis-a-vis China as well as the United States.
The sanction that we talked about is going to be voted on. We still do not know whether it will be passed, even though it is very likely to be. But it was delayed by a request coming from Moscow, suggesting wanting to read more about the content of the sanctions. Having said that, though, Mr. Yang, China and Russia, for years, have been opposing sharp sanctions against the DPRK, mainly worrying about something so-called faithfully weakening the regime, which will cause eventually many consequences. But why this time? Why the change of heart? Are the two countries going to make sure the balance is done, that is not going to faithfully weaken the regime, while at the same time punish what they have done?
Well, you're touching a very sensitive question.
So I have to relate to you, sir.
Okay. Yes, you're right. The draft has been, in my view, a relatively balanced. And why Russia focus on more on details for review or even for revision, I don't know whether or not they will make a revision, but it's highly possible. But the reason, I think, because of the two. Number one, It's a game between Russia and the United States. Remember, when we expect Russia to support the sanction proposed by the U.S., at the same time, Russia has been under sanctions posed by the United States and its allies. So it's difficult to imagine, say, for Moscow, on one hand, positively support the U.S.-led sanction, but meanwhile suffer from U.S.-led sanction either.
Yeah, well, that's for Russia, but what about China? What is the change of heart that has led China to this time quite agreeably go with every country, at least looking from afar, observing China, on the sanctions? Is that a click or a change of heart, Mr. Yang?
Well,
many of them wonder from outside this country.
Okay, let me put it this way. Russians' review or postpone was not designed to target at China, but target at the United States. Although they will certainly support and vote for the sanction measures. So basically, that's not a problem between Moscow and Beijing, but a problem between Washington and Moscow.
Right.
Yeah.
But what about China?
Well, I would say China hope, firstly, Russia should positively support and abide by the resolution, all measures by the resolution. And secondly, the revisions should not be too much, because too much revisions will trigger endless debates and the revisions and the
revisions.
We
all know how the system works in the US.
Now, the most important thing is we definitely need a quick passage so that we can quickly launch the resolution through the
A
UNSC.
concerted effort with speaking with one voice, that's likely to be the message being sent to Pyongyang. Ms. Guasoni, though, what do you think, coming from Washington's perspective, looking at China this time, and will China and the United States being described as by some Western press saying both working together to design this sanction? Is that a very clear description, a correct description of this round of diplomatic interactions?
I think only the diplomats sitting in the room discussing the details of those sanctions are able to say that. I mean, clearly,
this
from
is
the
a very
outside,
smart answer you
it's
give.
Positive. Well, one never knows, right? I mean, there are private conversations that even reporters don't hear about, but it's a very positive sign. It could be that China wants to take the reins a little more. It could be that this, suits China's purposes in, sends a message to North Korea. It could also be that China has simply just lost patience, that several of the initiatives that it's taken over the last year towards Kim Jong-un have fallen flat on their face. And, this is a final sort of message to the DPRK that, we've lost patience, and this is the result. So you need to get in line.
Ms. Moon, having said that, though, what about the other side?
Yes.
You've been an observer of the Korean Peninsula for long. What about the DPRK's possible reactions? Have countries working on the sanctions worked into their minds what might be the possible result? Will that push DPRK further down the road it's already sought?
Very, very pertinent question. But let me first get to your question that the other two guests were much more diplomatic about in terms of why China seems to be cooperating with the United States. I think it's very important. And you're right to push us to think about it. The Chinese government in the last 2 weeks has been very active. Wu Dawei, Mr. Wu, has been going to Korea for a 5-day visit. That is a long visit, to talk with various members of the South Korean government to try to get back the Chinese-South Korean relationship on a better track. South Korea was very disappointed in the initial responses that came out of Beijing, not being willing to push DPRK harder after January and February tests. But I think the recent diplomatic initiatives by the Chinese to go to Seoul, and then Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Washington, meeting with Secretary of State Kerry, I think these were very, very important diplomatic messages, not only to Pyongyang, but to East Asia, to the UN, to Russia, to the rest of the world, that the US and the Chinese, the Americans and Chinese, do have a very important shared interest in peace and stability on the peninsula, but also in the region. And we know that the US and China have tensions over South China Seas, etc. But I think the two countries are trying to find pockets, areas where cooperation can take place, and this is a good sign. Of course, in diplomacy, nothing is forever, but I hope the momentum will be there. There's also the fact that the Chinese have been very upset about the possibility of South Korea adopting the US missile defense system, THAAD. And what is really important is that the US and the South Koreans have been willing to send clear signals that if China will help and cooperate with the UN sanctions against the DPRK, that there is no need to rush into any kind of a THAAD deal between the US and the ROK.
What about the question?
Do you want me to talk about DPRK?
Certainly. What about what if
in terms of
have all sides working on this sanction ever thought about possibility of strong reactions going exactly the direction that no country hopes from the DPRK as a result?
Well, of course, that is a real possibility, and sanctions are a gamble. But I think this time around, the sanctions out of the UN Security Council are particularly important because the US and China seem to be working very much hand in hand, at least for the time being. So North Korea has to think hard. Does it want to defy both China and the United States together? And also, the fact is that so much of the materials and the financial, the funding for its nuclear missile development have been funneled through the Chinese-North Korean border. And so if that border is controlled more tightly, and if the surrounding seas are controlled more tightly, there is a chance that North Koreans will realize they will have to weigh the costs and the benefits, both economically of pursuing the program and diplomatically.
I see.
I also want to mention here, China is not the only country. I know that many people look at China as the problem in terms of the sanctions holding. But we have countries in Africa that do active business hiring North Koreans to train police and security military in Uganda, Zimbabwe, etc., buying cheap military equipment from the North Koreans. So in some places in the world, we need to help train the countries to actually help enforce the sanctions.
Right. Okay, let me quickly go to the other two guests. We only have a few minutes left. Mr. Yang, you want to respond to what Ms. Moon talked about, so-called China's starting point this time in the sanctions, working with others. And secondly, there are a lot of myths about DPRK and how they work with different countries. We do not necessarily know all the answers to this. There might be different versions, but the question is, has China anticipated what if after this round of sanctions? What would that mean for China's relation with DPRK?
Well, with the new resolution, China will increase measures on DPRK. I said increase, not a starting point, because we have adopted long-time sanctions against DPRK, especially from the 2013. It's a long list. We call it a blacklist against North Koreans importing. And this resolution will add more measures from Chinese government, the Chinese companies, and police forces. But as to your point, say, what would be the reaction from the North Korea?
Pyongyang, yes.
It's always difficult to guess. However, their slogan can be the glue for the answer. Say, stronger reaction against strong action. That is a political slogan and habit. So certainly there was some strong action or stronger reaction from Pyongyang. However, all options for strong reaction will be limited from some military drills or alert of war or some even more tests. That's it. I don't believe there will be a real shooting against the other and launching a war. I don't
Well,
think so.
we'll see what's going to happen. Mrs. Guasoni, what about you? Do we know what's likely to happen? Are we prepared? What could be happening?
Well, one of the issues right now that the Russians and others have been talking about is this export of aviation fuel. And so whether North Korean planes can refuel in countries such as China and Russia. So, you know, if you had a complete cutoff, you could really increase the isolation very significantly. I think they're stepping back from that a little bit. I think they're going to allow the airplanes at least to refuel outside. I'm a little, you know, I don't think we're there yet on the point of collapse for the DPRK. I think we've been heralding that for many, many years. But I also wanted to underscore one of the points that Ms. Moon made on the effectiveness of sanctions. You know, it's not only China, and that other countries around the world have been facilitating this regime's trade. You know, a panel of experts at the UN recently gave a report, and they said only 36 countries out of 190 had actually reported on their implementation of sanctions. So one positive thing, actually, with such a strong Chinese support for sanctions could be these other countries seeing that, well, yeah, there is unity within the P5, maybe Russia notwithstanding, and
I see.
And you know, some concerted efforts to train these countries, to get them to report, to stop their trade with North Korea could actually be pretty beneficial.